de América Latina que están hoy aquí con nosotros. Encantado de estar con ustedes. Bonsoir à tous et tous. C'est un plaisir de parler avec vous sur la situation de la liberté académique. Je vais me centrer sur la situation de, de l'Amérique latine, mais beaucoup de choses que je vais parler a des relations dans l'Amérique du Nord et particulièrement au Canada aussi. So, the issue about academic freedom is that it is an unknown right. Or we usually tend to frame academic freedom either as part of free speech or as part of right to education. So, and although there are important elements between them, academic freedom is much more than that. And usually we have tend to associate for a professor that the issue of academic freedom revolve around what a professor may or may not say during class, right? Regardless of the cancel culture elements, that's something that is a growing movement in the past few years. But academic freedom are also very important things that revolve around the purpose of the university or the mission of a university. That means for the right for professors, student, and staff to feel safe in the university environment. Academic freedom is also about the possibility for all the university members to participate in the governance of the university. Academic freedom is to have safe protocols to avoid racism or discrimination by gender. But also academic freedom or the academic freedom lens help us understand, for example, what is the structure, the ethnic, racial, and gender structure of our universities. Who are the professors that have the most tenure? What are their characteristics? How is the inclusion and equality non-discrimination play in the composition of a university body? This applies pretty much everywhere in the world. In the Americas or in Latin America, the issue of academic freedom has focused on issues of violence. That means a military dictatorship or an authoritarian government taking over a university and taking control of the university, the military actually a de facto control on who is teaching and what they are teaching. And this has practiced in the 70s and the 80s. But in the past 10 or 15 years, we are not necessarily seeing this as a regional trend, or although there are significant problems in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and of course Venezuela, where there is a political takeover and the forced takeover of independent university and independent research. But what we see is that there are growing concerns, or there are growing attacks against academic freedom using the terminology that I mentioned in the introduction, but these issues are not framed as academic freedom. They're framed either as a violation or a breach to the right to education, a breach to free speech, right? Or a right to physical integrity, depending on the cases that we're talking about. And we are, in this context, undermining or minimizing the role that universities play in the current context. And I would just like to focus on one case that is currently ongoing in Brazil. In Brazil, and in January of this year, two professors, one the provost of a university and the other one the vice president of research of the same university, were in an official webinar of the university, and they criticized the current Bolsonaro government for the lack of policies on addressing the pandemic and the lack of a coherent policy regarding vaccination schemes. let me just remind you that President Bolsonaro had even criticized the use of vaccination, saying that it is not needed and is only for a week, for the weak, etc., etc. So this happened in January 2nd or 3rd. In mid-March, just 2 weeks ago, the Office of the Comptroller, the Contraloría General, adopted a resolution prohibiting these professors from using public spaces or public university spaces to actually to criticize the policy or the Brazilian government's policy to address the COVID-19 pandemic. I have to say that one of these professors has been directing a national study on the impact of the pandemic in the country. So his research and his investigations could actually help build a more coherent public policy and see, where government efforts should be focalized. And the reason for this was that there is a law from 1991 that stated that all public servants, which includes public university professors, cannot undermine or cannot criticize their public officers and public peers. In the resolution, by this comptroller, by the national controller of the country, was that their positions, their statements, were disrespectful towards the president. This is the type of situations where we see academic freedom is under attack, where you use open-ended norms like public decency or morale to actually censor and actually affect or limit the possibility for academics to engage or participate in the public debate of issues so important like the current pandemic that we are all going through. And cases like this are present throughout the entire hemisphere, the entire Latin America, where more and more presidents or governments in Mexico, in Peru, in Chile, in Colombia, they are using their soft law powers, resolutions, administrative resolutions, or other measures like that, to actually limit critical views coming from academia. So, and the impact that this has, because this has been very successful, because people don't want to lose their jobs, right? People have to fear for their integrity. People are receiving hate messages and hate mail on a single day, on a daily basis. This affects their position, and this affects their role as university professors and the role of society. But these issues are seen as free speech. These issues are seen as issues of personal integrity, but they're not seen as what they are: an attack on academic freedom and the right of every professor and every university member to actually engage in public discussions, engage in the public debate, in the exchange of ideas and solutions, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic or any other topic. And we have, Catalina most likely will talk a bit about more other specific cases, but part of the work that we have been trying to do within the clinic is to actually visualize or to make academic freedom a right that exists. We have had efforts in Colombia. We have presented legal brief and participating in cases within Colombia, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and other places, and other forum, to actually bring light of what the right to academic freedom is, that the right to academic freedom, just as the human rights as a whole, is constantly being questioned and criticized and undermined. And part of the work that we're trying to do is to actually find venues through courts, okay, as we see the only measures, one of the most effective measures to actually is stop these constant attacks that are happening on a daily basis. And and to conclude, I would just like to focus on 2 points. One, on the current trends, particularly in Latin America, but I think are also applicable to North America. And secondly, the road ahead. What can we expect to see in the next few years on the issue of academic freedom? On the first topic, we are starting to see that states, that governments are cutting significantly the budgets of public universities, and they are also freezing the hiring of professors, forcing the universities to cut access to education. And if you know anything about Latin America, you will know that the population that goes to public university, with exceptions, are usually the most vulnerable, are usually ethno-racial minorities, poor people, indigenous peoples, or people that can only go if they receive some sort of scholarship. So when we're slashing budgets because of the pandemic, we're affecting the ones that are already the most vulnerable in the current times. So not only you will be suffering possible health implications, not only where the states governments are cutting public services all across the social board, but now your only chance to go to university is being undermined. So when we talk about academic freedom and we see the larger scope of representation and diversity, and one of the keys, or education as a means to progress, whatever your understanding of progress might be, we're affecting those that need the most. And this is also an issue of academic freedom. We're also seeing, not only in Hungary or in other countries in Central Europe, but also in Latin America, like in Brazil and Mexico, how public research grants are politically motivated or politically allocated. So it is like if the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council would be obeying whatever the Prime Minister orders them to finance. And this is what's happening in Brazil. This is what's happening, is starting to happen in Mexico. So we see how the pandemic has fostered a context where not only we're affecting the autonomy of the university, we're slashing the budget, but the university is forced not to address controversial topics for the fear of receiving even more or getting more cuts to their public budget. That is why, and this is Isaac. With this, I conclude. I think today, just before joining this meeting, our Human Rights Research and Education Center with Aula Abierta, I see some of my colleagues here also, will be working with the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is a regional human rights body created under the Organization of American States with jurisdiction on all 35 countries that make the Americas, on guidelines and possibly cases to actually create a legal framework that currently does not exist to protect and enforce academic freedom in the Americas. So these are all, and I know you have seen the memes of the Evergreen, a huge boat against a little bulldozer. Like, so this is the social political context on one side, and we are with a little bulldozer, with the little bulldozer trying to fight through legal institutions. But somebody has to take that fight, or have to start this fight, and we are very happy. And we're very happy to actually contribute to this. And spaces like this, provided by Isaac and his organization, helps us move forward towards more engagement and more public interest litigation on the right to academic freedom. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Salvador. A very interesting presentation and a very introduction, to the issue of academic freedom and how we should understand academic freedom, that it's something that goes beyond freedom of speech, as you said. I mean, we tend to kind of mix both, and I think we are not really talking about the same thing. And also we are seeing that the attacks against academic freedom, when you mention, for example, Brazil and the Bolsonaro government, is a clear attack from the, let's say, from a conservative right government. But then we are seeing, as maybe Catalina will talk in a moment, that attacks are coming also from the left, or at least a government that claims to be on the left, as is the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And maybe also François will talk later about how academic freedom has been undermined in North America by those who come from the radical left. Meaning that no matter the ideology, when you are pushing an agenda where the dogma or power is the main objective, then you end by undermining academic freedom, either because you cut budgets, as you mentioned, either because you attack professors, or either because you try to create a climate of intimidation and fear, and then try to have some kind of, dogma that will guide things that can be discussed and things that cannot be discussed. Then I would like to invite now Catalina to talk about her work monitoring the issue of academic freedom in several countries in Latin America and even in Canada, because I know your monitoring includes Canada.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catalina.
Thank you, Professor Isaac. So hello, everyone. Hola, todo el mundo. Bonsoir. I'm very honored, very, very honored to be here today. I know that CéC, Critical Education Critique, is an initiative that is started from the interest of analyzing the worrying situation of academic freedom in this part of the world, its cases, trends, and possibilities of transformation. And I'm willing and ready and honored to be part of this niche of reflection, where we as members of academic communities and civil society can gather, discuss, reflect on better ways to protect our right to dialogue and our right to build knowledge and foster better societies. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to having more discussion like this one. I will talk today about the challenges academic freedom faces in Latin America. The points of discussion I will share with you today are the result of an extensive process of monitoring and reporting incidents in the region that I and my team of students and professors from schools at risk at the University of Ottawa have done for over 4 years now. I will talk about cases, trends, points of discussion, and opportunities of advocacy. I worked with Salvador, and I was like laughing within myself because he mentioned the case of Brazil, and I was going to mention it because it is so emblematic, so it exemplifies many of the things that I wanted to say. So today I'm gonna talk about two topics: the limitation to freedom of expression, which is very aligned, very connected to the academic freedom, and attacks against university autonomy. If we have time, I will talk about gender violence or violence against women on campus. So in monitoring cases in Latin America, we have discovered two threats. The first related to a limitation of freedom of expression. The first was restriction to protest, and the second one, the use of law to censor government opposition. So Salvador talked a lot about these last point, the use of law to censor government opposition. But first of all, I wanted to mention some of the restrictions to protest. So student demonstrations have become fundamental pieces of the political and social discontent multiple countries in Latin America expressing. So we saw a lot of cases in 2019 and during the pandemic, and thousands of students in Mexico took the streets to protest against gender violence and to demand justice in the case of disappearing classmates, Multiple student demonstrations paralyzed Chile. You remember in 2019 when they were voicing their discontent and opposing the raised prices of public transportation and asking for constitutional reforms. You also must remember the students in Peru joined unions and other sectors to call for the dissolution of Congress due to multiple cases of corruption. And of course, the case of Brazil, where a great number of students and teachers protested across Brazil against Bolsonaro's federal cuts in education spending. However, the thing that students took to the streets is not the case. I mean, the trend is further complicated when the government response is added to the game. So in all cases, the governments in the region, in Latin American region, responded with repression and intimidation, using violent means to suppress protesters. So we had military police, anti-disturbances squadrons, used tear gas and even firearms to disperse the marches. Many of the participants were disappeared or detained, and many were injured, some killed as a result of the response of the police. So governments also protected and judicially shield the police forces in the acts of violence against protesters. So in general, across Latin America, the right to protest has not been guaranteed and even criminalized using the law. And so to exemplify the situation, we have the case of Colombia. So in September 2020, after several protests that began 2019, when all these unions and pensioners took the streets demanding changes from the government, the cities of Bogota, Medellin, Barranquilla were the scene of demonstrations against police brutality. Back in 2019, many people were injured and died due to the clash between the protesters and the police. And this time, most of the protesters were university students. In Bogota alone, in September 2020, 7 young people between the age of 17 and 27 died from gunshot wounds, and 209 people were injured. So political politicization in this case was evident in the handling of the crisis. So while the Colombian Minister of Defense referred to the protesters as vandals and criminals, the mayor of the capital, which is from the left, an opponent of the government, published on her social networks, quote unquote. From the Bogota mayor office, we can affirm that last night there was a discriminate use of force, of firearms, in various parts of the city by members of the police, who of course did not have any authorization to use these weapons. So the incidents demonstrate a pattern of suppression against student protesters in Latin America, which take place to punish and deter criticism of the state. This is a clear threat to academic freedom, and as students, as professors alike, experience significant brutality from the state when they vocalize their grievances over the pure shape of democracy in their countries. The other trend that we discovered during our monitoring and the limitation or restrictions to freedom of expression, it was the use of the law to censor government opposition. So in monitoring the cases since 2018, including the course of the pandemic, of course, a trend has become evident. So misinformation, reduced access to official sources, attacks against independent voices, persecution of the press, criminalization of NGOs, and the suppression of opposing positions have been the strategy most used by many governments in Latin America. 2020 was full of examples. We have in Venezuela, in March 2020, a presidential decree declared a nationwide state of alarm due to the COVID pandemic. The decree prohibits public gatherings and authorizes only competent authorities to take all necessary measures to enforce orders related to quarantine and isolation. Due to this decree, local organizations, media outlets, and even universities have reported that political persecution in the country has worsened during the pandemic. So emergency legislation apparently has been used as an excuse to violate fundamental rights. In June 2020, Honduras' new criminal code entered into force. It enables criminalization of protests and maintains criminal penalties for so-called crimes against honor, including insult and slander that can be used against journalists and researchers, professors, or student research assistants who voice their oppositions against the government. So we have witnessed the back and forwards in the process of defending academic freedom within the countries that we have studied. For example, in the case of Brazil that Salvador mentioned, back in May 2020, the Federal Supreme Court of Brazil decided that acts that violate the freedom of expression of the students and teachers and prevent discussions and debate within universities are unconstitutional. That is what the Federal Supreme Court said. However, we see the political use of the control bodies, like the case in these two professors, to silence critical positions against the government and to constitute, and that constitutes a great threat to democracy. So in that case in Brazil, the controller decision is worrying because it shows the control bodies as entities that can be used by the government to silence the criticism of public affairs. So that is a very important violation of academic freedom. We have another topic that we have monitored in our trends related to the cases that we have reported, is that attacks against university autonomy. So reductions in funding, disrupting policies, interference on academic governance are methods that unfortunately Latin American governments use to attack universities. For example, in April 19, the Minister of Education of Brazil suggested that the government would withdraw resources from particular departments, namely philosophy and sociology, which he alleged were courses for people already very rich from the elite, in favor to invest in colleges that generate revenues, like nursing, engineering, medicine, and the later Bolsonaro indicated support to this position. The only fact that they are mentioning that is an attack to academic freedom, because it's not only the revenue of the faculty that defines its importance. So to exemplify the situation, we have the case of Venezuela. And we know that the case of Venezuela is very complex. The regime has not only created an alternative system of universities that align their curriculum to the government, but also have established various mechanisms of control through budget cuts, the managing of salaries, they censor their researchers' opinions. So, for example, referring to the budget, public universities in Venezuela depend entirely on the budget assigned by the state. It leaves public university open to politicization or funding decisions, and can expose some universities that are not aligned with the regime to funding shortcuts. So as the country economic crisis grew, resources appear to have been increasingly diverted away from open university towards Chavista University. So to make the situation worse, the last the last thing that we heard is that the Plan Office of the University Sector announced this March, like 2 weeks ago, that the payment of salaries to teaching and administrative staff of public university will be made through the Patria platform, which is completely controlled by the regime. So we echo the words of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Twitter. These type of measures can configure violation of university autonomy and labor rights, inhibited the exercise of academic freedom, academic expression of teachers and workers of public universities in Venezuela. You cannot talk badly about the institution or the people who pays you. So in the case of these trends, we can just talk like for hours about this. And it's very worrying. The violence against women, the cases are just heartbreaking. But every attack, we can conclude that every attack to academic freedom, whether restriction to protest or censorship to a specific or particular voices, whether budget cuts or intrusions into university governance, whether killings like the ones that have happened in Mexico, or disappearances, or even violence against women, are attacks. I mean, they are putting democracies and societies at risk. So we need to protect academic freedom in order for universities to become safe places for people to dialogue, to ask questions, to debate. So that is our duty as a society, because we need stronger democracies. As a result, we need stronger universities. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Catalina. Great presentation also. I think it's really troubling to see what is happening in the region, in Latin America. And now we can compare, I mean, because one of the ideas of this forum is really to have a kind of a comparative view. I mean, certainly we are facing challenges in Canada and North America, but we are far from these vicious attacks against students, professors. And just to give you one element of context, in Venezuela, a full professor salary, full time, it's maybe between $3 and $4 per month. That's it. That's the salary of a full professor in Venezuela. And as you can imagine, how we can attack academic freedom from, from different points. Now I would like to invite François Charbonneau, and he will present the North American perspective. And I am assuming, François, you will be presenting also the Canadian perspective on these issues. Thank you, François.
Certainly try to. Donc bonjour chers amis et collègues. Hello everyone. Hola todo el mundo. And thank you, Google Translate. Let me first start by thanking Isaac for his invitation. I didn't know Isaac before the current crisis that we're going through at the University of Ottawa. Les crises sont de grandes révélatrices de la qualité morale des êtres humains, and I'm honored to call Isaac my colleague. We're here to discuss academic freedom because it's going through a rough phase, but I'm discovering, I mean, I knew, but I'm rediscovering once again that it's going through a rougher phase elsewhere. And I'm obviously aware of this fact in going through the following presentation. Now, I could explain why academic freedom is essential, why it matters, and why every single university professor should be defending it vigorously. But I felt in preparing this talk that I would be preaching to the choir. Academic freedom has been and is still under threat from a variety of sources, from governments, obviously, as we've seen, market forces also, which we haven't mentioned yet, but are very important pressure points on universities, dictatorial regimes, extreme right-wing and left-wing ideologies, and so forth. But I want to think about the way in which it is now under threat from within universities themselves in North America. Albeit it's a different type of threat, more insidious, and it's important that we understand what it is, where it comes from, and how we face it. At this moment in North America, academic freedom is in danger of being limited, mainly for now through fear that leads to self-censorship, but also by internal pressures and the threat of being canceled, because we're at the very last stage, this is the claim that I will make now, at the very last stage, hopefully the very last stage, of a long process that I would call the self-esteem revolution that began in the 1960s. The self-esteem revolution has had different phases, and I can't talk about all these phases, had different branches too, but it now found a new impetus in what I would call a perfect storm of amplifying factors. The fact that we now spend our lives looking at our phones, the polarization inherent in social media, the election of Donald Trump didn't help much, critical race theory, and so on and so forth. So I'll try to make the claim that the main threat to academic freedom in North America comes from the very bad solutions that universities are trying to implement through DIE initiatives, trigger warnings, and so on and so forth. So I'll do three things. I'll explain briefly what I mean by the self-esteem revolution, how this revolution has morphed in the last few years and became a threat to academic freedom, and how finally we start digging ourselves out of this mess. So what's the self-esteem revolution? Well, in the 1960s, it was discovered mainly through surveys of students that there's a correlation between poor academic success and what was then called self-loathing. So to sum it up, students who did not think highly of themselves on surveys had a tendency to do also, or there was a correlation because they also, these same students, had a tendency to do poorly in school. And what happened next is a fascinating story because it resembles very much our own predicament. We imagined at the time that the solution was to build self-esteem. I mean, in theory, that makes sense, right? But here's the problem. For some bizarre reason, we started to convince ourselves that the way to build self-esteem is to avoid failure at all costs. No failure, no low self-esteem. Education departments, school systems, and society in general became obsessed with self-esteem and is very much so to this day. Some school systems eliminated grades altogether. In others, you no longer can be held back. We started to give participation trophies. That's probably the most ridiculous form that the self-esteem revolution took, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, it's possible that the correlation between low grade and low self-esteem did exist, but it's quite obvious that the solution to the problem was entirely wrong. And yet, despite being completely wrong, it still persists to this day. In all likelihood, you don't gain much self-esteem when you gain a participation trophy. You gain self-esteem perhaps when you fail and work hard to overcome hardship, if that opportunity exists, of course, in your society. Every great comedian, every great artist, every successful individual will tell you that failure was instrumental in their later success. And I might add, self-doubt is not a bad thing. Not just self-esteem is a good thing. The one thing to keep in mind, even though the solution to the problem was nonsensical, it was once that revolution was started, it was difficult for anyone to criticize that great self-esteem revolution, because you could be accused of doing something detrimental to kids. Okay, so the self-esteem revolution morphed into different things. In the 1990s and early 2000s, it became political correctness, and I could explain how it is linked to self-esteem. But what I want to talk about is its latest metamorphosis since perhaps 2015, 2016 or so, and how it has affected campus life in North America. So in The Cuddling of the American Mind, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lugianoff explained very clearly how, starting around that time, a new phenomenon emerged on campus. Students began to use new vocabulary, safe spaces, microaggressions, to discuss the potential harm that can be caused through the very activity of learning. Now, I won't do the genealogy of how these new ideas emerged within a movement called critical race theory, but I do want to explain briefly the supposed problem that some students are said to be facing on campus. Now, according to these ideas, students attending universities, women, members of racial minorities, can be potentially hurt in unintended ways by being exposed to ideas that are said to be difficult. For instance, the students who was sexually molested as a teenager might relive the initial trauma if a professor discusses the topic. In order to avoid this trauma, and this seems very reasonable, professors should thus offer students the ability to leave the class so that they're not put in a situation where they have to relive their past experience. Now, in theory, again, this makes a lot of sense. Who wouldn't want to prevent potential trauma for their students? But in reality, this is wrong in a multitude of reasons. Now, the first point against this logic was made by someone else, by Jonathan Haidt in the book aforementioned. He made the case that it is wrong because students are not fragile, that it's preferable to face your traumas. Now, as I'm not a psychologist, I'll just move on from that first point. But it is also wrong for two other reasons and the effect that it has on campuses. The first reason is that once you accept the premise that students must be warned in advance, lest they suffer trauma, you're making the quest for truth dependent upon the tyranny of emotions. That is, everything that happens in a classroom or is published in research or whatever is susceptible to be considered an affront to cause injury, to be a microaggression to someone somewhere. Now, this tyranny of emotions makes classes absolutely impractical. According to this logic, and we now have an unlimited number of examples of this sort of nonsense, uttering a word can cause offense and thus be banned, even when taken out of context. A man discussing a feminist concept can be construed as an aggression. A text by one of the very first modern feminists, Olympe de Gouges, denouncing slavery can't be discussed because she was white, and the title of her piece, De l'espèce d'homme nègre, could potentially trigger a student. Now, in the very same way that education today is not better than it used to be, despite the massive faith in the holy grail of artificially boosting students' self-esteem, that has done nothing to increase the student success so far. Attempting to put in place measures to make students that no longer, to make sure that no students rather is ever offended, that students are never confronted with so-called difficult material, and sometimes difficult material, of course, will have, I think, on the whole, the exact contrary effect. So for instance, trying to make sure through diversity training that no microaggression can ever occur makes everything worse. Now, in theory, the concept of microaggression makes sense. I don't doubt at all that it can be annoying for someone to be asked, where do you come from? When you were born and raised in the country in which the question is asked. And it was perfectly legitimate for minority groups, or minority group advocates to show that this kind of behavior can take its toll on the dignity of individuals, of course. But when a university says that students are the ones that get to define what a microaggression is, which is what my own rector said last fall, well, they're actively encouraging students to become hypersensitive to the possibility that any word that a professor utters is a form of aggression. If you give this kind of power to anyone, they will abuse it and find aggression in the tiniest of anecdotes. In other words, the more you trigger warn, the more you're normalizing the idea that it's okay to be triggered. The more you create safe spaces, in the context of North America, in the sense that we're giving to that word, safe space means something when I hear it in other contexts. In North American context, I'm doubtful. But the more you use that expression, the more you're normalizing the idea that it's normal to feel unsafe in a classroom. The more trigger warnings that will be included in courses outlines, the more students will look for reasons to be triggered. The more mandatory diversity training you impose, the more people will see race inequalities in literally everything, which is bad because we need to see it where it is, not where it isn't. That's our job. Now, the problem, of course, is twofold. The first one is that we're not solving the very serious problem of racism. You'll notice that none of the crises that occurred in Canadian universities in the last year had anything to do with racism. It cheapens in comparison to everything we've heard so far by my esteemed colleagues. It had everything to do with a perverse incentive for students, woke professors and administrators to find racism where there was no such thing. Veronushka Lieutenant-Duval, a colleague of ours at the University of Ottawa, uttered the N-word simply to illustrate a point about subversive reappropriation. She was thrown under the bus with a shameful flippancy from administrators. But this whole woke movement that's supposedly trying to deconstruct the patriarchy, the colonization mindset, and so on and so forth, claims to be speaking truth to power. But that's not what's happening. We imagine that this crisis was provoked by a few students, but nothing could be further from the truth. What we have in front of us is a power grab in which ideologues are creating new institutional power structures within, for instance, diversity and inclusion initiatives, diverting funding and research grants towards certain topics, not preventing certain texts to appear in certain journals. Now, these things are not theoretical. They're already interfering with the content of what we're teaching in classes, the programs we'll be offering, the hirings, the words that can and can't be used in classrooms, the funding for research that we can no longer obtain, and so on and so forth. In other words, they're not speaking truth to power. They know what they're doing. They're speaking power to truth. They're speaking power to truth. That is, they're seeking those that are seeking the truth in universities have to first bow down to this new powerful ideology. University is a place and tenureship is the mean that is supposed to be free from undue influence from power of any source. The question that we ask in universities are supposed to be uncomfortable. And I'll give you one uncomfortable example. There is said to be right now a wave of feminism, a feminicide rather, in the province of Quebec at this very moment. It's a very sensible topic. 7, perhaps 8 women were killed since January by their spouses, which is statistically higher than usual. Journalists and activists have been putting pressure on the government to intervene, to invest in prevention now. Now, it's quite possible that the violence against women is on the rise and that the changes in public policies that are being requested are necessary and will do good. That's one hypothesis. But we should have, if we want to have rather sound public policy, we must also be able to take a step back from the horror of the situation and not succumb to outcries. We must be able to ask questions such as, is it possible that such up spikes occur from time to time? In other words, are statistical abnormalities normal? Is it possible to ask such questions in classes without seeming to be callous towards the victim, without triggering anyone? Now, if the answer is no, if every iniquity, every injustice, any horror requires of us thunderous indignation instead of rational reflection, then we should conclude that social sciences and humanities are pretty much useless because they cannot possibly help us make informed and rational public policy. If the point of a 4-year bachelor degree in social sciences is to convince students that they live in a racist, sexist, patriarchal society that can't even be doubted or discussed, then it is doubly pointless, because I can assure you that most students are absolutely convinced of this before ever setting foot in a university. So what's the way forward? Well, it's hard to tell. One thing is absolutely sure. As proven by the case of Verushka Lieutenant-Duval, universities that try to appease the woke movement by DIE initiatives, mandatory trigger warnings, etc., will fail miserably. I'm hopeful that universities will defend academic freedom vigorously. They will become successful because students in those universities will get a real education. Good profs will go to these universities and so forth. Eventually, and that's my hope, a new form of progressivism will come along and tell us how wokeism and DIE initiatives were profoundly racist and thus must be now combated. Hopefully, this new progressive movement will be based on humanism and reason, and not on yet another variant of the self-esteem virus against which no vaccine has yet proven successful. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, François. Thank you very much. A very interesting, reflection on the challenges that we face in North America and in Canada that maybe are different from those that our colleagues and students are facing in Latin America. But I see that there are some commonalities. I mean, we are both facing kind of a dogmatic view of society sometimes, like in the case of Bolsonaro or Maduro, where facts don't matter at all. I mean, governments, regimes, or even ideologies that they completely are let's say, they don't value facts, data, truth, and also the use of power. I mean, different kinds of power. What you mentioned is very important, the power of emotion sometimes, the way of using emotion as a way to intimidate people and to create a climate of fear and insecurity. But, I have already here, and I would like to open the floor for questions from our friends, from those attending the event. I have a couple of questions here, one coming from Nestor Garrido, who is in Caracas now in Venezuela. It's for the three of you, I don't know. Have you experienced cases where students accuse teachers of being biased when they give them poor test grade? Is this part of a fight against academic freedom? Isn't this extortion? I don't know if someone would like to comment on that. Yes, Salvador, please.
Well, I will start. As an aspiring professor, I've never been accused of bias, but there's always complaints about the grading. and I think that everybody who's involved in university has always receives a lot of complaints. We're about to start exam season, so this is the time where my grandmama gets sick, sort of epoch. But on a more serious side, I think that your question is important, but I'm not necessarily see it as an issue of academic freedom, but also more like as a predictability and reasonability, because usually the syllabus are supposed to include the grading criteria, what are the materials, so there are clear rules under which the professor will evaluate his or her students, right? So not necessarily I would see it as an issue of academic freedom, right? Because the professor, his freedom is to choose the syllabus, to choose the program, and to choose the method of evaluations according to university or his or her department's rules, right? But there are situations more like on the flipping side of threats to academic freedom, and unfortunately there's a one that made global news 2 weeks ago from a professor from mathematics at York University, where a student asked for an extension for him to give his final exam because he is from Myanmar, and he was on Myanmar, and with the coup d'etat they had cut the electricity, they had cut internet services, so he had no way to actually submit his final exam. And the response from the professor was, "That's your problem." So I'll share in the chat the news from the Guardian about this situation, right? So I think I'll just put this, that academic freedom has many elements, right? But to help everybody, right? And I don't see necessarily the complaints from students as an issue of academic freedom, as long as there are rules and everybody understood the rules, and these are set previously, under which a student will be evaluated. But there are situations that could come to elements not necessarily linked to academic freedom, but to basically discretionary and abuse of power.
Okay, thank you, Salvador. Any other comment about this issue? Because I have another question here. Before I go to Mark, from Radami Zaki, about how can we define safe space? And just to give you an element of context, depending where you are in the world, safe space could mean a different thing. And as we saw in Catalina's and Salvador's presentation, and I would like, Salvador, if you can just briefly talk about that case in Colombia, where you wrote these amicus that play a very important role in one particular case, just to illustrate the difference between safe space in a Colombian university when a professor is sexually harassed and safe space in Canada. Maybe they don't mean the same thing. Then you can briefly talk about that case, and then I will give the floor to Mark.
Okay, and no, I think something very important from François is the issue of always understanding context and how the specific rights play in different circumstances, and locations. In the case of Colombia, is the case of Monica Godoy. She is a professor of a feminist and a professor of gender studies. So she was in a public university in Colombia, and she demanded her provost to actually adopt a policy to address and prevent sexual harassment and sexual violence within university campuses, within his university campus. She was so determined, and she actually led a group to work on these protocols, and because of her insistence, the university fired her, saying that it did not reflect the views of the university. It did not reflect, that gender studies were not necessarily within the policy or the mandate of the university. She presented a constitutional recourse in Colombia, and it's called Acción de Tutela, Recurso de Amparo, but the case was framed as a labor issue, like a wrongful termination of a contract. While the case is pretty much academic freedom, the right to participate, to create a safe space, as Isaac was mentioning. What is the mean of safe space? Safe space is that your professors will not harass you, or say, "I'll give you an A if you sleep with me." So, and these are pretty much citations of accusations that come from universities in Latin America, where students, women, have had to force themselves to video themselves being harassed and molested by their professors to actually make a case, because otherwise they don't believe them. So that was a case that she actually won the case. She got reinstated in the university, and she quit later, a few months afterwards, to pursue other projects. But these are the type of situations, that reflect, when we talk about safe space is different perhaps in Canadian context than in other contexts, and so it is always important to take into account the particularities and situations where we are.
Thank you, Salvador. Then I will ask Mark to ask his question. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Isaac, for putting this together, and to the speakers for their contribution. I wanted to talk a bit about, not so much this idea that students would pressure profs into giving them better marks, but I've heard something that is quite disquieting in the discussion with a dean of a faculty, which I won't name, that would talk about academic integrity. And the fact that you may not know, but I was on the frauds committee at my own faculty for academic plagiarism and stuff like that. And we know that unfortunately, some students or categories of students are overrepresented as customers of such things. Often these are foreign students who haven't been trained quite the same way. So from the point of view of some woke, very anti-racist woke would say that the proof that our rules are racist is that some categories of people are overrepresented in students that have been accused of academic fraud. The same way we could say that the system in the United States is flawed because some groups are overrepresented in the jails. You see the same kind of logic. But in this case, we were being told that the very rules that we have to get in place are racist because people from either Africa, Northern Africa, the Middle East, or China were overrepresented there. And I said, well, no, what we need to do is maybe have a training for foreign students so that they get to know what the rules are in terms of referencing accordingly. And I was told I was racist because I would be asking some people to be trained in order to bring themselves up to the standards of academic integrity in Northern America. Well, the result at the end is that they are overrepresented because they get accused of the same thing. And then that is racist as well. So you see, it's not so much the idea of students. I think that there's an issue, not so much of academic freedom, but an issue of academic integrity. So now profs are sometimes feel that they should not accuse a student of committing academic fraud, if that student belongs to a visible minority. And then I'm starting to say that this would become descending to those very people, because we would say that you need not observe the same level of academic integrity if you belong to an underrepresented group. You see the kind of eggshells that we're starting to play with when we mess with these things. So that was my little 2 cents.
Thank you, Mark. Any comment about this? I have another question here, but before I continue with the questions in the chat, Catalina, please.
Yes, one thing that I wanted to say is that, for example, in the case of gender violence against women in Latin America, we can see the two tendencies. So we have the idea that Professor François just mentioned, is that everything was considered important or difficult for some students. In this case, for women, everything was harassment. And we have also the tendency of universities and professors that had the normalization of violence as a way to protect themselves and deny the act of harassment. So in the case of Latin America, one of the ways that universities have developed better solutions to deal with gender violence is creating protocols. So they said, okay, we have the protocol, and we know within this protocol we define what gender violence is, what sexual harassment is, what microviolence is, and then we can just depart from that and try to come up with some sanctions or processes to follow for the victims and for the aggressors. But then the victim said it is not enough, because for us it's just so much. I mean, the space is so insecure. For example, Mexico, we have this year a demonstration of many students in the main university in Mexico City saying, we need to study. Mom, we want to study, but we can stop professors from harassing us. So we need to create a safe space to study and to research. So it is just, how can we align, or how can we convert these two tendencies to not pass the limits, you know, because it is not to normalize the violence because in some cases there are racism, in some cases there are gender violence, but how can we define some of the concepts so we cannot come up with just sensitive students that say, oh, everything is harassment, everything is racism, you know? That is one thing that I have been thinking a lot about, this Me Too movement, and we can be safe now around the world.
Thank you, Catalina. Before I go to the next question in the chat and then also ask Mireia to intervene, Mireia Goldwasser, I would like François to comment on
well, I just wanted to say that that's the difficult predicament in which we are now. Exactly what you just said, Catalina, because in a way we're cheapening what violence means, what aggression means, by calling literally anything an aggression. So the solution, I don't have a magic wand, but there for sure in universities that function well, that are well funded by a state that's non-intervening. So I'm talking about mainly Canada and United States, Europe, and perhaps in some places in Latin America, but that's outside of my field of expertise. University administrations must resist this. I mean, they are the ones that are supposed to say that you shall not pass, and the way you don't pass with ludicrous accusations that are cheapening what an aggression means or whatever, is for them to go through, first of all, not to jump on the bandwagon of accusation, which is what happened at our university, to tell the world, listen, we're not on Twitter timeline. We're not on Twitter time here. So there's an accusation. We're going to take some time. We're going to do an inquiry, a process, and then eventually, because in the case, I mean, that's the one we have fresh in our mind, but Lieutenant-Duval, I mean, she did literally nothing wrong. And instead of saying that she did nothing wrong, that she had no bad intentions, the university dealt with this as a media crisis. We need to show the world that we're serious about anti-racism, so let's destroy the reputation of this part-time prof. Well, that surely cannot be the solution, right? And of course, it's even problematic to compare this type of reality to the very dramatic description of the reality for some women, or for women in general, I would say, that Catalina described. So at least in universities that are well-functioning, well-funded, there needs to be a change of mentality and administrations. The thing that they're starting to realize, at least in my university, is that giving in to every single moral panic about, I heard a word, I saw a phrase somewhere, if we give in to that, it's endless. It's an invitation. Come on, kids. Let's and everyone is riled up, and we know human beings human beings have an uncanny capacity to convince themselves of anything. So we can convince ourselves. I mean, think about this. Students at the University of Ottawa are studying in one of the top 150 research universities in the world. They are privileged kids, no matter what their color of their skins are. The average amount of money their parents bring home, if you take all of them, places them easily in the top 2-3% in the world. They're privileged kids. but they have convinced themselves that they are in the most racist of institution, and they are told to see racism everywhere. And that's what the university has been telling. Well, I'm sorry, but that's cheapening what racism is. And we should, and at some point you just say, no, that's not the case. But the difficulty is that this is not just a few students. I would say in social sciences, it's a heck of a lot of professors that are sort of convincing themselves that we're in the greatest of I mean, listening to some of the public intervention, and I'll finish on this point, you think that we're in South African apartheid or Jim Crow, in the United States in the early before the 1960s. It's absurd. And if we don't have, if a university is not a place for measure, if university is not a place to say, hold on, there are grave problems in some places, there are minor annoyances in others. If we can't make these distinctions, what are we for? What are we for if we can't even make this distinction? So that's my point on that.
Thank you, Francois. And I think one way to make that distinction maybe sometimes is to compare notes, as we are doing today, and realize that we are not in such a bad position. But I have questions in the chat, and I know Mireya Goldwasser also wanted to intervene. Just I'm going to read here quickly one question from Professor Luis Ordóñez from Caracas, from Universidad Simón Bolívar. Are all teachers equal? How Latin American society perceive the university teachers? Are they perceived by many people? And then he talks about a concept from Professor and late Catholic Father Alejandro Moreno, the hendidura, but that's not easy to explain, as well-being upper-class people. The question, I think, what Professor Ordóñez is trying to say is, are really university professors valued by society, at least in Latin America? And I'm not sure sometimes in North America. But maybe, what about Latin America? What do you think about that, Catalina, Salvador? I mean, how people will defend, or how society would defend academic freedom when professors are not valued?
I would just put it this way in Latin America. Could you make a living just as a professor?
No.
I rest my case. That's it. It is not a profession dedicated that is valued enough for you to make a career. There are exceptions. El Colegio de México, okay? I think about Concitec in Argentina, Instituto Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. So there are hubs, but so it is a different environment. Okay, it is a different environment. But it also has advantages. In a way, the precariousness also brings some competitive advantages, because you have in Latin America, and I'm speaking from the law. I am a lawyer. I went to law school. You might not have that mega super hyper text cited professor from Oxford University Press or Cambridge, but the guy that is teaching you is the president of the Supreme Court, or is the president of the Constitutional Court, or is the minister of whatever. So when he's teaching you, what he's teaching you is how some of these legal and political changes took place because he or she, mostly he, was on the sitting table. So the precariousness also gives us some advantages to have these high-level professionals that are making the law, interpreting the law, for better or for worse. They are forced, or they teach the university, and they teach it as an expression that many of our colleagues here from Latin America understand is por amor al arte. Right, because they feel it feels a way to pay back to their university, so they do that pro bono, taking full course loads, but just for that. But so they're valued in a way, but financially, or to make a career, a research career, you're only in exceptional hubs.
Thank you. Okay, yes, Catalina, quick, because yes. I would like to
yes. Quick, very quick. I would add to Salvador's opinion one thing. They are also a very dangerous figures because they are being silenced. They are being censored. So if every time a professor in Latin America just publish research that is against the government or that is against the regime that is in power, they are silenced and they are arrested, prosecuted, killed. So I think they are very not only valued, but also considered very dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mireya Goldwasser, if you're still here, please proceed.
Yes, I'm here. You know, but most of the question I have has been already answered by intervention. I really congratulate all the expositor in this forum because it has been very interesting and important. But I feel myself, I thought was going to be something different. I mean, I am a professor, full professor at Central University and the Faculty of Science. I am a chemist. And at this moment, and I am the president of the Venezuelan Academy of Sciences. So I am a bit, you know, inside the science and education and so on. And right now at the academy, we are discussing all this that you are doing, but from a point of view different, because what you are doing is very important, and maybe more important than the one we are thinking, but it's most related to human rights concerning professors and concerning students, and that is really important. But for example, in my case, I don't feel that Venezuela is a disaster from any point of view that you see, health, economics, political, whatever you think, education is really is a disaster.
Okay,
but
okay,
I don't
just,
feel
okay,
myself,
just to clarify, okay, you think that Venezuela is a disaster. Okay, just it's a disaster.
Okay. See, well, but from my point of view, we don't feel, I have never feel the gender exclusion. I really don't feel it. At the science faculty, the number of women, the girls that are inside now are higher than the boys or the students from the other gender of, you know. So I don't, some things, I don't feel it like that. So I think that I was thinking we have, from my point of view, at Venezuela, we have to look at the university, because really, at this moment, whatever you think, it doesn't work. That's the point, that we have a lot of very clever people leaving the country and going to other countries, other universities, because, as you said before, the salaries are so low that you are not live with that salary. And to do research, I am a researcher. My grade at the university, I am a researcher, professor, but researcher. And right now it's very difficult to do any research. So that's what you didn't see that I lost my hand, because what I was thinking was a bit different. So
okay, good. But thank you for your contribution.
I'm interested in what you are doing. It's very important. And
yes, and maybe we can be in touch, because we are working with some of your colleagues in Venezuela right now.
Okay,
we are doing some things with that. Okay, then I have two people who raised their hands. I see Maida. I don't know if Maida, you're going to ask the same thing.
I just wanted to say, well, hello to you.
Okay, Maida, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to say, yeah, that I am totally agree with Mireya. Hi, Mireya. I'm happy to see you here. Yes, because I see also that I am having people, I mean, in the issue of women, I'm having also people from the press that are approaching me and asking me.
Mireya, if you can mute your mic, please. Thank you.
Yes, approaching me and asking me, no, you have to say the problems. I mean, all the differences with women, the problem that women, they don't have access to universities, etc., or to research. And this is not true. And what I asked, what I answer also always is, well, this is not my experience, not as a student and not as a professor. I am a professor of law, philosophy of law, and I always had much more students, female students, and they were much more better. The second thing I wanted to say is that we are also the 13th of, I would invite you, the 13th of April, we are going to have a seminar with members of the Academy of Sciences, Joconda San Blas, and some other researchers, that we are going to talk about science in Venezuela and how this attack to universities and the restrictions to universities, public universities, are affecting also the right to science. And so this is going to be the 30s, and I think it's also good to have this perspective, because as I mean, we are also in the context of a humanitarian crisis, and I think this attack also to the right to science is also related to the humanitarian crisis we are having now. And I think the only way also to be able to advance and go ahead from get rid of this crisis is by recovering research, scientific research, and of course the main thing of the universities, that is this knowledge production. No?
Okay,
this is
thank you,
what
Maida.
I wanted to say, and say hello to everybody.
Thank you, Maida. We don't have that much time. I see that Carla Matias raised her hand. If you can quickly ask a question, if you have a question, please, or make a quick comment. Carla.
Yeah, I'm going to give, I'm Brazilian. I don't know if there are any other Brazilians in the group. It's just some background information briefly. I believe that the situation in Brazil is not only about propaganda or, you know, the idea attack against ideas at university, but also there is a large number of people in Brazil from the population that supports this attack against university because of a resentment, the difficulty to access higher education. In Brazil, just for the sake of background, to go to university, you need to pass a very difficult exam. The best universities are public, you don't pay anything, but in order to pass the exam, you need to have private education when you are younger. So only the higher classes go to university. So it's just to say that this attack, part of it is related to attack against ideas and academic freedom, but there is popular public support also of this attack because of this resentment, because of this, how the university, what it represents in Brazil. It represents the elite. I'm not giving excuses, I'm just giving some background
but that's a very good
information.
point. Thank you, Carla. This is a very good point, because this is another phase of populism. You know, this anti-intellectual, anti-elitist position that we have seen, for example, in the case of Donald Trump in the States, in the case of Bolsonaro, but also somewhat in the case of Venezuela and other so-called revolutionary regimes. You have these populists pushing, you know, this populist agenda, saying, you know, this is not about the elite, this is not about the intellectuals, it's about the people. The people.
Yeah, especially just adding those who understand Portuguese, will understand what I mean. But if you hear Bolsonaro speaking, he knows how to speak the language that is the complete opposite of university language. And people, most of the Brazilian population relate to that. So that's why so many people are under threat and are leaving the country. There are professors leaving because even their neighbors hate them for being part of the university.
For being part of the elite. Okay,
Really.
thank you, Carla. I would like just to ask the panelists, François, Salvador, Catalina, if you would like to add something before we finish. Is there something that you would like to comment or say?
Well, perhaps briefly, obviously the situations are quite different from one region of the world to the other. And I think that our colleagues in other parts of the world need our help. I think now, well, that's probably cliche, but now more than ever. I'll say this though, there is a risk that what was just described by our colleague Carla can occur also in North America. I mean, if universities keep on preaching instead of being spaces open to inquiry and open to students from poor classes, because in Canada we have a chance. I mean, there's still, I mean, obviously it's still people who are in means that get to universities, but there's funding. So if a poor student wants to go to universities, there are grants, there are funding. We should make sure to keep those and reinforce those so that we don't create a situation in which there's resentment because people feel excluded from universities. We have to cherish that. That's very important. But we also must remember that universities are not there for indoctrination. Woke ideology can be taught in universities. Obviously, if we have freedom, there's freedom for that type of teaching also. But unfortunately, if the danger is that we're hiring more and more of these ideologues, and if universities become so much ideological that people feel that they don't see themselves, the greater people don't see themselves in universities, it becomes a niche to despise society. I'm afraid perhaps we'll reproduce the same type of model that exists in other countries. So we're not there yet, but it was certainly an interesting experience. And thank you very much, Isaac, for the invitation and all the guests for your presence tonight.
Thank you very much. Catalina, Salvador, any final comment before we finish?
I would like to say that it is important for me to realize that that although we have many differences, we also have things in common. For example, the way that universities are stopping. I mean, they stop reflecting. They are like leading the discussion in social media. They are normalizing the violence. They are following up for example, the testimonies of victims of gender violence just to keep their names out of the landscape. So instead of doing that, I think these spaces of reflection, of discussion, are the ones that could be or must be fostered, because universities are the spaces, not only safe spaces, but are the spaces for reflection and to say, okay, stop this. What can we define as violence? What can we define as intrusion in our autonomy? How can we define racism or anything? And just start like thinking as a community. That is a very important takeout that I have in my mind now. And I also thank you everyone for being here.
Well, thank you, Catalina, Salvador, François, for your participation. Thank you.
Isaac, if you just had to say just one thing in 20 seconds.
Yes, please.
Bom, primeiro, Carla, muito obrigado pelos comentários. É muito importante o que você disse sobre a elitização e o acesso privado por temas públicos. But on the first side, I just want to end in two positive notes. One, it is welcoming that we're having these discussions. We have ignored this. For better or for worse, these are issues that have not been properly addressed in the past. So at least, whether we don't want to say this is woke or not woke, these are important elements for us to discuss, regardless if we're in the north or in the south. Secondly, no discussion cannot take, a discussion must always take those allegedly affected groups. That's the meaning. thinking from a human rights perspective, from a human rights litigation, it is important to have them sitting at the table, not just for 1 or 2 consultations and the illusion of democracy and participation. That's a very important element and pedagogical part of this process. And thirdly, I do believe that at least in Latin America, litigation as a human rights breach is the way to go to start pushing this conversation into effective action and concrete changes that will improve the right to academic freedom. So I will leave it at that. Thank you, Isaac, once again for the invitation.
Well, thank you, Salvador. Thank you, François. Gracias, Catalina. Thank you, Catalina, and thank you to all the participants for your questions, your comments, and this will continue. I won't stop, and I count on you. I won't stop, okay? Because we should have this conversation without fear, open, and a free discussion. Thank you very much, and good evening. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Merci.
Thank you, Profe. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, bye, bye. I thank you very much for your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.